is happening in the Pokrovsk area. The Russian occupiers have once again missed their own deadlines. At first, they talked about some dates in October, then they set November 15th. Now they're already talking about December, but as they say, nothing has changed. The American Institute for the Study of War has recently written that, in fact, the Russian occupiers are no longer trying to encircle the entire agglomeration in the Pokrovsk area, and that currently it's only about this particular settlement. According to your information, what is happening there now?
As you know, the Achilles unit carries out missions in the most difficult sectors where active combat is taking place. I put it this way, where there's tumba matumba, either it's approaching or it's already begun. Tumba matumba means very intense fighting, where the enemy is using its main forces and resources to achieve tactical results on the battlefield. We talked about this on air before, and the situation remains the same. If we take any other section of the line of contact about 25 kilometers long and analyze how many defense forces will be able to detect the enemy using various reconnaissance means and destroy a certain number of enemy forces from that total. So if you take 25 kilometers of the line of contact in any other area of active combat, neither the Pokrovsk nor the Dobropilya nor the Kostiantinivka directions, but for example in the Kharkiv direction, say the same Kupiansk, it would be up to 200 servicemen of the Russian occupation forces detected in a single day. If you take that same section of the line of contact, only about in the Pokrovsk direction we are seeing up to 500 servicemen of the Russian occupation forces. As a result, the enemy is now deploying an unprecedented amount of forces and resources to achieve a tactical result, but their efforts are being thwarted by our defense, by the defense forces of Ukraine. And as a result, the enemy is unable to carry out the tasks assigned to them by the Russian occupation generals, and overall by dictator Putin. But this may come at the expense of several factors. First, we must understand that the Ukrainian army performs a heroic feat every day, because we are resisting an enemy who surpasses us in the amount of equipment, exceeds us in the number of artillery pieces, munitions they can use, and in the quantity of certain types of drones, such as fiber optic guided drones. The enemy is ahead of us in this regard, in terms of the intensity of use and, of course, in manpower as well. Meanwhile, the defense forces have fewer resources and personnel. Additionally, we should also mention that Ukraine has been rocked by certain corruption scandals, which have directly affected fundraising by large volunteer organizations that supply a huge number of drones to the front every month. That's why I'm now addressing those watching us in Ukraine and those watching us abroad. Friends, I'm asking you sincerely, we need your help. There have always been and always will be corrupt officials. What's really important is how the law enforcement system works. If the law enforcement system has uncovered this fact, it's a good thing that in a country at war, the authorities are able to find those who want to rob their own state during active hostilities. But we must stand together with you. We shouldn't look at this as a reason to stop funding our defense forces. If someone is stealing somewhere, that doesn't mean we should stop providing money to our defense forces. After all, we give to the defense forces in order to protect those who are protecting us. I mean, the military, and we provide for drones, we provide for things that make it possible to destroy the enemy who surpasses us in strength and resources. In my view, if we manage, and I am convinced that we will manage, to maintain a united front, and if the necessary equipment, including the drones you are purchasing, is delivered to the defense forces where it is needed, then we will succeed. In the short term, the enemy will not be able to achieve the tactical results set for them by the Russian occupation generals and dictator Putin. But for this, we must, no matter what, remain very united. Both those who are now in Ukraine fighting with weapons in hand, and those who are abroad watching our broadcast and have the opportunity to help the unit they trust and the defense forces as a whole.
Yuri, well, I really hope that our viewers understood this message and, as they say, have taken it to heart and will act on it. By the way, speaking of work, according to the General Staff, between November 10th and 15th, Ukrainian defenders reduced the Russian occupation army by 524 soldiers killed and 260 wounded. And actually, I have a question for you about what is currently happening with the Russians, with their human resources. Because, for example, an officer from the National Guard of Ukraine's Rubish Brigade Chernyak reported that the Russians have brought in such a large number of infantry in the Pokrovsk direction that our defenders haven't seen since 2022. There really are hordes of them there. Where are they getting these people from? Should we expect that Putin will announce a full mobilization in his country?
We need to understand now, as I mentioned earlier, that compared to a 25-kilometer-long front line, there is an unprecedented concentration of forces and resources, so I fully support my colleagues, but at the same time we must realize that manpower is a resource which, if used the way the Russian Federation does, as expendable material, will eventually run out. And also our strikes now deep inside the Russian Federation against targets that process and enable the further distribution of petroleum products. These strikes on such targets are what allow us, Ukraine, to achieve results, as the Russian Federation receives fewer petrodollars, which means it has less money to spend on purchasing ammunition, weaponry, and on modernizing various means, such as Shaheds and other drones. And in addition, of course, we should mention that there is less money to pay their own citizens to go to war against Ukraine. Because right now, in the Russian Federation, the army is mostly made up of contract soldiers, mercenaries who deliberately go to fight against Ukraine for money. And in principle, their families support this. That he will go and either be wounded or die on Ukrainian soil from the weapons of the defense forces. And for them, that's even better because there will be payouts, and those who agree that their husbands or sons go to fight against Ukraine believe they can significantly change their way of life. But when the money runs out, Putin has to come up with some other solution because they don't know how to fight any other way. They need a lot of resources, a lot of manpower. And as a result, just look at what the State Duma is doing. The State Duma has now passed a law that allows reservists to fight on the territory of other states. So the first positive thing is that no matter how Russia behaves, it is acknowledging that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state. Secondly, by doing this, they are also admitting to all the atrocities and acts of terrorism they have committed against the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people. And thirdly, what we need to understand is that an additional 2 million reservists in the Russian Federation have now been granted the right to fight on the territory of Ukraine against Ukraine. By right, I mean the right given to them by the Russian Federation as its citizens. That is why Putin is laying a foundation that will allow him to have manpower for a certain period of time to wage war against Ukraine. We need equipment and drones in order to destroy them.
Yuri, just recently, some units have officially reported that Russian armored vehicles, including several different types, have started to appear and have been seen moving in multiple directions. They hadn't been seen for quite a long time. There had only been assaults using electric scooters, almost even bicycles, and so on. What should we expect next with the change in weather? After all, the winter season brings its own specific adjustments. We have literally a minute and a half left.
It's a matter of cause and effect. Why doesn't the enemy use lightly armored vehicles when the weather conditions are good? Because their equipment is destroyed by Ukrainian drones even as it approaches the line of contact. This is a practice that we, as the defense forces, have been able to establish on the line of contact thanks to the drones that you buy for us. The second component, why has the enemy started using these means now? Because of poor weather conditions. Fog, rain, wet snow. These are the weather conditions that reduce the effectiveness of unmanned systems. And as a result, the enemy is trying to take full advantage of these weather conditions and move their manpower using lightly armored vehicles. But there are other means as well. Countermeasures, engineering preparation of the battlefield, and other methods that I will not disclose. That is why the defense forces are coping with this task as well.